Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Jon Myer Podcast. Today's topic, the Evolving Ransomware Threat and how to keep your data secure. We're joined by two guests from Cohesity. Our first guest is Jed Wallace, a staff technologist, and our second one is Vic Camacho, a principal technologist. You know what? Jed has spent the last 20 plus years progressing through his career at a medium to large scale enterprises and primarily in the financial services and state and local governments. While Vic has more than 25 years experience in the IT industry, he has held various roles ranging from system architecture to field CTO. Please join me in welcoming Jed and Vic to the show. Jed, Vic, long time.
Yeah, it's been a minute, huh? It's good to be here again.
Yeah, I think the last time we got a chance to get together, we were live in Vegas. We sat down, we had a nice discussion within the Vidar during reInvent that was going on, and we were talking somewhere similar along the same topic, but this is a little bit more in depth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the last conversation we had was, it was a little bit more focused, a little bit focused on cybersecurity, but we were all over the map, right? Because there's so much to talk about. It made sense to kind of focus in on just one element, just because it's still heavy in the news. So we figured that'd be a good way of going.
Yeah, and John's favorite term, rack 'em and stack 'em. We were talking about some administration and the good old days.
I'm going to avoid that for just a little bit, or try to keep that out of this podcast. But I cannot guarantee anything because you're going to bring back some of those fond memories. Today's topic is the evolving ransomware threat, and from Cohesity standpoint, we have Vic and Jed to give us some of their insights and some of their expertise on the topic. Vic, I'm going to start with our very first question to kick things off is, what do you see as some of the most significant cyber threats facing organizations today?
Oh, that's a great question. So, I think at least for everyone on this podcast, everyone knows it's still ransomware, right? It's in social media, it's on the news outlets, it's being talked about with the reputable cybersecurity outlets that report on this. And the number one threat is still ransomware. There are other cyber threats, but ransomware is still top of mind for good reason, right? They're still having success. And so when you have success and some of those are big payouts, you tend to go with what works. And so ransomware is still the number one threat that exists today for organizations.
Jeff, are you still seeing the same thing? Are you seeing as ransomware one of the biggest threats to organizations still today too?
Yeah, 100%. And I think AI. Yeah, I'm going to bring it up early. AI is everywhere, right? It's the new cloud, right? Everybody's using the term. Generally, they're not using it properly. But now anybody can go and get ransomware code from, an AI and just, start working their magic. So I foresee, we talk about, state sanctioned attacks from, say, overseas, but, what about the random kid who now has access to highly sophisticated AI who just says, hey, can you give me a ransomware, code? And then boom, there they are. They're ready to go, and they don't really need to know much. It's almost like ransomware for dummies. So I think that's actually going to probably eventually overtake, some of the more organized threats we see.
You actually mentioned a good thing with AI, right? So I attended RSA, right? I was working the show, but I got to attend some sessions, and they had this panel come up, and this one gentleman in particular was talking about how AI can be used for good, but that it can also be used for bad, right? So threat actors are using it, and he had a conversation, and I believe this was with ChatGPT, but they were asking, what he asked ChatGPT was, hey, can you look at this code snippet and tell me where some vulnerabilities are at? And so it came back and said, yeah, here's where it could potentially be a vulnerability, and it was using like Stack Overflow on it on a particular piece of that code. And from that, he was able to say, well, what could I write in order to compromise this. And when ChatGPT first came out, it would give you the code. But now that it's evolved, it's saying, well, this kind of sounds like ransomware, that it was not going to provide that. And so this is like a conversational thing going back. We're like, well, no, I'm not doing that for that. I just want to ensure that I understand that that I know how, where I can kind of shore this up. And so ChatGPT, and he's putting these excerpts, right, came back like, well, in that case, then this is how you would potentially do it. And so it was just kind of like, okay, now I know how I can take advantage of this vulnerability.
Vic, I don't know.
Goodness. I can see this. Oh, I can see where this could go wrong in so many ways. Now, wait a second. I didn't know I could ask ChatGPT about my ransomware code. Yes. First of all, now you're putting. We're going to get way off a topic here, but this is just unbelievable. Thinking about how the generative AI, I can put in this code and say, where's some of my ransomware? Great. Let me take this and now let me go see if I can actually do it. That's on the good actors, but now you have bad actors who will do the same thing. Be like, how can I make this vulnerable? How can I get in there? But isn't it, you're also dropping production code into ChatGPT, which is now they're taking that code and they're looking
and
at
owning
it.
it.
It's going to be part of their algorithm.
They own it now, right? We just read about that. It's supposed to be proprietary to that company, whoever it is, X, Y, or Z, and they throw in that code in there to see if there's any errors, and lo and behold, you just now gave up ownership. You just
gave them your production code.
That's right.
You know what, Vic? How do you even stop against that?
Well, I mean, again, it's you vet employees out, and typically they're good people, but you do have threat actors out there that will absolutely take advantage of that. And so the session that I was watching is pretty much was, what can you do about it? And the gentleman threw his hands up in the air and said, you can't, right? All you can do is create this cybersecurity awareness around now with artificial intelligence, and be aware of what it can do. So it's going to be, hey, you have code here, don't put it in here because now they own it. And so it's huge, right? And it's all in there, but people want to use the technology, so they just kind of blow right. Like, how many times have we just kind of went right through the EULA, right? It's like you scroll to the bottom, click.
Whoa, wait a second! I read the thing from top to bottom.
I'm sure you do, John.
All 3,000 pages of it, John.
I always read the Microsoft one. It's about 10 times I got to click. Yeah, right.
That you give them your firstborn. It's all the stipulations in there.
Yeah. So I mean, in terms of that, though, I mean, you have to be prepared, right? You still have what I call the simple checks and balances that you can still put in place, right? You still have to follow zero trust, principles, and employ zero trust architecture. And even if you do all of that, you have to be able to detect for that kind of malicious code, like ransomware, as an example. So the best you can prepare for the worst and hope for the best. But when you talk about AI and putting that code up there, you have to be smarter than that. And so I can see that there's going to be a whole other aspect. If you think through this, there's going to be a whole other aspect where, compliance and legal, now they're going to have some other things to work on because of AI. It's going to be, it's transformative, but it can be used for both good and bad. So,
but Vic, doesn't that really kind of lead us to the topic of knowing your data? Knowing what's sensitive and what's not. Starting. The starting point for, I think, anyone is knowing what data your organization has, and who's accessing it. And if there's PII in that data, I think that's, for any organization, that might be really the first part of any kind of audit or anything, or how you want to move forward in a security posture, is knowing what data you have.
Well, yeah. And when you think about the rate that data is growing, right, much of it is still a lot of unstructured data, right? It accounts for 85%. And it's growing at an exponential rate, and that data can live anywhere. It can live within your on-prem data centers, like traditional data centers. It can live at the edge, like your remote office and branch offices. And of course, it can live in the cloud, right?
What's
So
that fancy
now,
term you use? What's the fancy term you use, Vic? Silos.
yeah, exactly. So now you have these data silos everywhere, and you have to manage that. And so managing the data is key, but knowing what kind of data you have is just as important, especially if you are if you are a healthcare organization or you're in retail. All of those types of industries, they have to adhere to certain regulatory compliance. And so if you don't know where that data is at, then how can you possibly protect it? So you have to know where that's at. And that's where things like data classification comes into play. And Jed, you know about data classification too. I mean, being that you worked in government,
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of sensitive data there, constituents,
Elections. I mean, you talk about PII, that's been in the news for the past, 6-7 years, right? Voter data, voter rolls, the DNC, RNC, all that other good stuff. So
Okay, we're getting a little political. I'm going to steer us away from the political topic. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. I know we're talking ransomware, but you're talking obviously understanding your data, where your data is and what it is. I want to understand what are some of the biggest threats that organizations are facing today with ransomware and how they're protecting it. But before I jump to that, I got a couple comments on the generative AI and understanding and educating. Right now, everybody goes through training or will be going through training for generative AI and understanding the process about putting it in there and understanding that the data leaves it. And you're all dependent upon the people to understand, your employees to understand, while they are not doing anything maliciously intent, they are doing something without realizing that they're giving this data out there. But you have to depend upon people, which goes into social engineering, which goes into probably one of the biggest threats of organizations, whether they realize it or not. Vic, what do you think?
Well, I mean, these phishing attacks today are so sophisticated, and they are starting to use AI to determine what a person's interests are, their likes, right? To compromise their credentials. I mean, these phishing attacks they look legit. They used to look legit 3-4 years ago. Now with AI, they are so much more succinct in what a person will click on, what are their interests, that it becomes almost, it's like what's the term, like Pavlov's dog, right? They just used to clicking on a certain type of information, and so all you got to do is send that out. And so organizations, we have to be 100% all the time. A threat actor only has to be perfect once. And you just said this right now, John. People are going to be the weak link in the cybersecurity chain, right? It's always going to be us. We're prone to errors and judgment, and so all it takes is one click. You click on one link that sends out the pink slip notification. The pink slip virus.
Jed, I want to give you a chance to comment. I don't want to say people are the weakest link, but in reality, that is very true. And I got a couple comments, but Jed, I want to get your feedback on what Vic is saying with regards to how AI is actually enhancing some of these phishing attacks.
Yeah, I agree with Vic. It's only going to make it more complicated to look at an email and say, okay, we're getting training now, and in the past few years ago, we were getting training to look at the email address. Does it have some weird characters in it? Does it look like it's coming from a valid sender? Those things are starting to, they're starting to bypass those with more complicated tool sets that they're able to use. So it's hard to keep up, but I think like Vic said, you got to do your best to try to, detect these problems before they, cost you a lot of money. So
I think Vic said it clearly, is that we have to be right 100% of the time, while a threat actor only has to be right once, that one click that comes up. Vic,
Yeah.
I'll tell you a little to something that I learned the other day with generative AI and how, and I actually use it daily. I play around with it. I test some things out and I make sure that the data's not going in there. But I was talking with my daughter and how they're really taking like somebody's voice and giving you a call and saying, "Hey, mom, help me. This is on." And it really sounds like your kid. At that point, I realized we all needed a safe word, right? A word that nobody uses if we don't post anywhere, we don't share anywhere. Oh, really? Something's wrong? What's the word, right? And if they don't know the word, I mean, it could go both ways, but in most really, you're just trying to be safe and secure. It's one more step. It's like multi-factor authentication. It's one more step to prevent them from actually, impersonating you.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. So as that session that I attended, um, they talked about that. The lady that came on and talked about that experience. She is in the cybersecurity industry, and she talked about using that. And so she was talking about just what you just mentioned, John, is using simulating somebody's voice. You're already seeing it on Instagram and social media, where they're taking that voice pattern and matching it and then adding it to video, and it sounds and looks just like the person. But I'm going to move over to Jed here because we're former military as well. So when you say the safe word, the word of the day, that's a great technique, right? So Jed,
Yeah.
what do you think?
Uh, I think, my train of thought went slightly negative. The fact that, John's bringing this up, and I'm like, inherently security is inconvenience for everybody, isn't it? So the fact that, they're going to be targeting people even more now, and we have to have even more implementations like safe words and stuff. It's just, I'm just thinking, like, where does this stop? I mean, our poor children in 20 years, where are they going to, what are they going to have to put up with, because in 20 years, AI is, it's it's not going to be anything like we're talking about right now, right? It's going to be a whole different other animal in 20 years from now. I can't even envision what it's going to be, but I think it's just a sad state of affairs. I don't mean to go to the dark side, but it just, I know that it could be used for good. There's good people out there, but of course, there's always going to be the bad actors. So,
Well, of course, there's always going to be those bad people, but the good has to you basically overcome, right? You have to have that training. You have to do that. Vic, going back to my original question is what are some of those biggest threats that organizations are seeing? And then like, how can we stop them? What are some things that we can do against it?
Well, I mean, it's always going to start with cybersecurity awareness. So you mentioned training, right? Definitely having periodic training to keep it fresh in people's minds, in your IT staff, in your users' minds, is going to go a long way. Because I mean, I sometimes have to revisit some kind of education or some kind of doc to kind of bring those things back up to mind, because we forget, right? You just go with your daily duties, your daily jobs every day, and you forget about these little things that can land you in hot water, for lack of a better term. But cybersecurity, it starts with cybersecurity awareness, properly training everybody, keeping it top of mind. It's certainly um, a lot, and I said this earlier, it goes back to some of the fundamentals, right? Ensuring that you have, you know, if you're following zero trust principles, and some of those could be microsegmentation of your network, as one. Ensuring that you have really strong role-based access controls, that you're not using a simple password, username and password, because we already know that those are easily compromisable. So implement some type of MFA, multi-factor
multiple
authentication,
multiple copies of your backups of it,
multiple copies of your
in
backup.
in different regions,
Absolutely. So, Jed, you just touched on it, and I know you can talk to this too. And that is right. Data protection is huge, because if they compromise your data, your local environment, and you don't have an effective backup strategy, and a strategy up for your backups as well, right? And that would come in the form of data isolation, because
Yep.
if you do become compromised locally, and your local backup copies become compromised, then what happens, right? You need a clean copy of your data that you can recover from. And today, a lot of that is, your tape backups that are stored off site, right? And so you can also do storing your backups in the cloud in an immutable fashion so that if ransomware ever did get in, there's nothing that it can do. It's a read-only file.
That's right.
Right. And so you can take these steps, I call them precautions, but they're extra steps to protecting your data, securing your data. And a lot of that is with encryption. A lot of that is keeping it far, far and away from the rest of your on-prem environment so that if you do become compromised, you're not going to be affected. And you can avoid paying the ransom because you can recover. So that's for me, I think those are some of the key things that we can do for any environment. So as an IT leader, I would be looking at, having a strong play, whether defined, have it well documented. And then, at that point, it's just about looking intelligently for threats, right? So you have to implement some form of a system, some mechanism that can intelligently look. And this is where you can use AI and ML for good, where you're detecting indicators of compromise for ransomware, using intelligent machine learning threat detection to be able to do that. Right? Because, looking for anomalies the old way was a good first pass at it, but using AI to help you, it's going to be much more efficient than any, person can, and they could do it at scale. Right. And having that in place is going to go a long way. Being able to protect is great. Being able to detect early is better. And being
So
able to
analyzing
recover.
it.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I agree. Having those, you could see companies now, they're trying to bake in these things into backup software, data protection software. They're baking in these tools so that people have them and they feel comfortable with it, as opposed to tying into someone else's service. This is within the platform you're using. We're not connecting out to another service to say scan or to do these kind of things. But again, I'm not knocking partnerships. Obviously, you have to have partnerships for certain things. But like I said, you got to be able to detect these things, and analyzing your data, I think, is key.
Yep. Understanding
So,
where the data is at.
so let me ask you this question real quick. So, everybody, we're talking with Jed Wallace and Vic Camacho from Cohesity. Our topic today is the evolving ransomware threat and how to keep your data secure. Jed, you were talking about multiple copies of your backups, security. Vic mentioned security and roles and everything. At what point do you get that you're doing so much that there's so much overhead? What are the trade-offs in order to do this? I understand that if you don't do these things, you're compromising security. But there's a point where you have to have a balance of not only the security aspect of it, but actually running your business.
Well, I personally would ask the question, what costs more, having the proper tools in your network or paying a ransom? Vic, what do you think?
Well, it does, right? I mean, I'm not recalling top of mind right now what the average cost of a ransomware breach is, but it is astronomically much more than it would be than to put the systems in place to avoid, right, and mitigate. And that's what we're
Yeah.
really talking about: mitigating risk wherever and whenever you can, because it's if you don't have an effective uh, cybersecurity strategy in place, then you're opening yourself up for a breach, and that can have catastrophic consequences, especially if you're a medium to small size business and getting breached. Many of these organizations, they're not going to be able to meet the demand of a ransom in the first place.
And
So I think it to your point, Jed, it comes right down to, Wayne, if we get breached, then what? And does putting this thing in place, if it can mitigate that, then I would take the lower of the risks, right? So you're mitigating the risk, and that's what business is at the end of the day:
it's
mitigating
dollars
risk
and cents. Yeah.
and putting yourself in the best possible position for success for your business.
I mean,
Cybersecurity is just part of that now.
I
It
mean,
always
uh,
has been.
It is dollars and cents, dude. I mean, when at the end of the day, we're talking about business, right? And we're talking about $100,000 versus several $1,000,000. I mean, you know, it's kind of a no-brainer to me to this day and age to have the proper tools in place to, to analyze your data, protect your data, and keep you out of those situations.
Okay, so Vic, let me ask you this question. It used to be that we were hearing about ransomware a couple times a year. I feel we don't hear much about it now. Is it not happening? Is it happening so often we're just kind of used to it? Or is there something bigger out there that's happening that we're not aware of that we need to start inventing for, we need to start protecting against?
Well, it's kind of both, right? So I think it's been in the news so much that to some degree, perhaps we've become desensitized to it. Like,
We're definitely numb. Yeah.
We're a little bit numb to it. So we're a little desensitized to it. But, now you have state sponsored attacks, right? Not just threat actors here at home. Now you have state sponsored attacks. And not to get political, right, John? I know we try to steer away from those kind of topics, but, the reality is that the geopolitical climate today is having a direct effect on here in the U.S. and other countries abroad, where state-sponsored attacks are being conducted because certain nations are supporting the Ukraine, as an example, right?
That's the new arms race. It really is.
And so
I actually agree with you. I agree with you that it's no longer, soldiers on the ground, right? It's all the attacks are happening from a distance and they're at a larger and massive scale. And the state-sponsored attacks are just one of many things that are being happening.
Yeah. And, and so when you talk about state-sponsored attacks, now you're talking about government, right? And so in February of 2022, CISA, or the Cybersecurity
Security Agency,
and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, came out with their Shields Up initiative because they were going based off of real live intel, right? Actionable intelligence that these things were going to happen. They had already saw this influx. So it was their attempt to help organizations and, private enterprises put up certain cybersecurity measures in order to help mitigate against that, because it was coming and it is coming. But those are some of the new threats that, I'll call it newish, but
so
it exists now.
I actually dealt with the Homeland Security, and you could take part in, and this was no small thing. They would actually deploy sensors in your data center, and so you would have that. It wasn't IDS, it was IPS. So it was IDS, intrusion detection, right? So they would scan all the incoming and outgoing data. Now, yes, I know to a lot of people, they don't want someone else's sensors in their network. But when you're talking about, say, election security, it's a no-brainer, right? Because you're responsible for the public's data. So you have to keep it secure. So this is more of like an interagency cooperation type deal, right? So sometimes you don't see that because we bring it back to silos again. There's like 1,000 different agencies within the United States that are, trying to mitigate these attacks. And sometimes I think there could be more cooperations and more of a consolidated effort, but, that's just my opinion. So
I think you need to be good stewards of the data, whether it's yours or somebody else's, and realize that you need to protect it at all costs and what's going to happen with it. Vic, when we were talking about the cost of it, Jed, you even indicated, can you afford the cost of a ransomware attack versus the software, the stuff that you can protect it? Here's what happens. Everybody assumes they're not going to get hit. Oh, I'm not going to spend $100,000 and $1 million to protect it and do all these things. I'm not, You know what? I'm going to be okay. That guy over there is going to get hit. When in actuality, it's not if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. It's only a matter of time.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
go ahead.
We I hate to say it, but, bringing it back to the CISA or the cyber defense or Homeland Security, they have all kind of grants out there and everything for smaller organizations and everything to help them secure their networks. So there's no lack of funds or help out there. They're willing to help you if you ask for it. I think the problem that I've seen is that people aren't willing to take on that help because I don't want people touching my network, or it's I don't know if it's a pride thing. I don't know, but
or
the
even
help
too
is out.
costly to
Yeah,
implement. They have to redo their entire architecture, their implementation. They have to understand it. I think that just the wheels of progression move too
yeah,
slow in some instances. A
I
smaller
agree.
company will be able to do it more efficiently than a larger company. I know about a month and a half ago, there was actually a hospital that was hit by a ransomware attack. Imagine that you're sitting in the hospital and you can't get to your medical records. You can't access them until they actually pay the ransomware for it. And you don't even know if they're going to unlock it after you do it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we're always talking about the inefficiencies of the healthcare system. Please digitize my records, and then here we are, right? So,
I wish I had a paper copy then.
yeah, exactly.
Oh,
no, but yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, not only do hospitals have to, contend with the ransom, but they also, I mean, this is patient healthcare, right? This is patient data that is directly tied to a patient's care, and that's what they do. And so I could see that this could this has life or death implications in some cases, and you don't want to certainly don't want to give the wrong medication, and so when you think about it in those terms from a healthcare stance, you definitely want to have a strong cybersecurity mechanism in place. Have it documented, have it in place, practice it. What would happen if A, B, and C happened? And again, it comes back to being prepared and awareness.
Vic, what does a strong cybersecurity practice look like, though?
It depends, right? It can be different for different organizations depending on the kind of use cases they have, right? If I can put my architect hat back on, but you know, some organizations already have some parts and bits of it, and it's just a matter of filling in the other parts of it. So maybe they have an IDS or IPS, but maybe not a strong data protection solution, right? In the case they do get hit and they need to be able to recover. So that question is very broad. So I think it would depend on what industry they sit in, what kind of data, understanding where their data is located, and having that in place and practicing it are two very different things. And yeah, it does take cycles away if from their normal day jobs or what their normal activities are. But what are the consequences if you don't? And so I take it back to what Jed said. It's going to be more cost. It's going to be more time consuming, and so you have to weigh what's the lesser of two evils here. And I would venture, if I were to venture a guess, it would be let's put these things in place so that we don't fall victim, and work harder if something like that does happen.
Yeah, and I could speak to the fear that that ransomware attacks can put in the organizations. They can tend to overreact, and then they put every solution into their network under the sun. And I've seen it done, and it's not necessarily a good thing, because now you have half a dozen security products in your network, and sometimes they don't have the staff to manage these things. I mean, it's different when you're a giant corporation or organization. We won't name any names, but it's a different thing when you're small to medium-sized businesses that don't have these dedicated security analysts to analyze alerts coming into the SIM or things like that. They don't. But there are things out there that they can do, and I think having a current, up to date, tested data protection.
I love how he's like,
Tested.
Oh, that
Uh,
could open up a whole bunch of ones. Yeah, I implemented all
yeah.
this stuff, but I don't even really know if it actually works. But I did implement it and I checked the box.
Yeah. So, I mean, just having a solid data protection in place, which includes simple backups, it includes backups at different sites, whether that's, a copy of your immutable read-only copy in the cloud or, on tape or whatever floats your boat, that's fine. And also, I think another thing that we fail to talk about sometimes is having the proper DR in place, because I think ransomware it does overlap with disaster recovery, I think, don't you think? And maybe having having that replicated data to the cloud, that immutable copy, so it's a little bit more of a peace of mind, that way you can recover in days and not months. I mean, so
you mentioned something, Jed, right? Organizations do tend to rotate sometimes, right?
yeah.
If something's happened, or they know of an organization down the street from them that got hit, and so sometimes there is this over rotating on stacking up with cybersecurity solutions. So one, again, need to understand where the gaps are, right? Understanding where the gaps are is going to be go a long way. Using a system that has some of this baked in already will go a long way.
Something
Right?
more unified.
A little more unified,
Yeah.
but also, and you hit, and both you, Jed, and John hit on this, is the integrations, right? Being able to integrate with other cybersecurity organizations that do this on a day-to-day basis, right? It's in their wheelhouse,
Yeah.
and being able to tie into that so that both IT ops and security ops can be bridged, so that they can work from their respective tool sets and not necessarily have to cross train. It will go a long way, because when you can do that, then you can detect ransomware or other cyber threats a lot earlier, and then be able to recover from that. Having that ecosystem is going to be huge, but you first have to identify where the gaps are at. And once
Yeah.
you've identified where the gaps are at, then you can go and look for that solution that can potentially already tie it into something you already have. You may have two solutions already that aren't talking to each other, but can. And so that,
Yeah, and I want to clarify something I said earlier about tying in. I was really specifically talking about someone just arbitrarily tying in an AI platform into, say, their data protection platform, and then trying to marry the two together. That's where I was. That's why I want to reiterate, having strong partnerships is important. That way, you have that level of trust when you do tie in with another platform. So I just wanted to clarify that.
I think one of the biggest things is that the detection is key. Early detection is key, because here's what's happening. Most of the detection's not identified for a month or two afterwards. And then backups are already corrupted and it doesn't matter what you have. So now you're at one point where you cannot recover if you're doing like 30-day backups. If you're doing longer, 30 days is, heck, 2 days is a long time in any type of production with the data changing at a very high rate. But detection early on is key, but obviously to avoid it in general. But I think that's where AI is going to help us. I'm not saying Skynet's coming. Sorry, I had to throw that in. I know you guys are waiting for that to come. But what I'm saying is that we're constantly evolving. If we have AI evolving to threats, malicious things that are happening, we can immediately make those changes. That's where you don't have enough staff to do it. AI is helping you out. So there's a lot of positives around it. Yes, people are going to use it for malicious stuff, but it's going to learn what people are using maliciously to start protecting it in a good way.
I
I like
agree.
to use nefarious.
Yeah, and the thing is, like any other, essentially it's still a program, and so companies are still going to be good companies. They're gonna build their own machine learning capabilities, right? They're going to write it themselves, and that gives me a little more comfort, because some companies are going to do the right thing, and hopefully more than just some. And I think that's something to think about, is when you're looking at a company for, say, data protection or something, is what are they doing? How do they handle their AI? Are they right? Do they build it in house? Are they partnering with somebody. These are questions that need to be answered, I think.
Oh, no, I'd agree. John, you just said that, the whole bit about using AI, and Jed, you mentioned the same thing. Being able to detect it is key, right? And so there are solutions today that exist that's solely what they do, right? With these indicators of compromise. Um, Now it's machine learning, but like anything, right? It's learning, so it doesn't necessarily know of every threat that exists out there yet, right? It has to learn about it. The new threats have to make it out into the wild, and so as it learns, it puts that into its threat feeds, and then organizations like us at Cohesity, we have that, so we can ingest those feeds
Or the
and then
IOCs, right?
scan for those indicators of compromise, and for the latest threats that exist, the known threats, right? Because there still can be unknown threats that haven't been discovered, but as they are discovered, that's where machine learning can pick up on those. And then for those that have not been compromised, they're going to be able to take advantage of that so that they can help, mitigate the risk of becoming falling victim to some cybersecurity threat.
And Vic,
And because it's ransomware, that's one of the ones we're looking at.
Vic, what have you seen? I know what I've seen as far as they're updating these IOCs on literally
Daily.
every hour, right? Every minute. And so if you could connect into these feeds, which a lot of companies now have that capabilities, firewalls and things like that, data protection solutions. If they can get the near real time updated list of these threats, it allows them to be more proactive, and they don't need 10 guys out there trying to, play whack-a-mole and hunt these things down. So
unfortunately, we don't know that they're happening until they actually happen. That's almost like, kind of replacement parts or patching an instance. People have to report on it in the wild. And yes, there is extensive testing going on various codes. But Vic, we talked about not only IDS, we talked about training, awareness, social engineering, how, state-sponsored stuff's happening. What are some of the things immediately you can do to help mitigate these or potentially protect yourselves against it?
Well, and and I think we've kind of danced around it, right? We've touched on it, but uh, having that system in place that can tie into everything, being able to detect early is going to be key, because as we all know, the longer ransomware sits in an environment, the more opportunity it's going to have to look for data that is not sitting there in a read-only, way.
ruin your backups.
Yep.
Your backups. It's going to go. You're going to have to, shore up your backups, because threat actors and ransomware have evolved over time, right? They become more sophisticated. I think the first one was just to encrypt the data, and then as a first attempt, and then when it evolved, it was all about going out, and now we want to go after your backups, right? We want to go after a company's insurance policy. So if they compromise your backups, the likelihood that they collect on that ransom goes up. So they're sophisticated attacks, right? They're continuously changing their TTPs, or their tactics, techniques, and procedures, is what it's known as. And then there was stage 3 was data exfiltration, right? And so it becomes really important then to ensure that you have role-based access controls and multi-factor authentication and strong microsegmentation, so that you can minimize the blast radius, right? Because that falls into the double extortion play. Not only do they encrypt your data, but now they're threatening of leaking it out into the dark web because they've exfiltrated the data. And because data can live anywhere, at the edge, in the cloud, there's multiple egress and ingress points. And so now you have to look at all these ingress and egress points that we've created, because we want to be more dynamic, because we want our data closer to our stakeholders. And so you have to ensure that data is being looked after. And when you think about that, you really do need to have role-based access controls in place, multi-factor authentication, a secondary approval process, so that not any one person, if they do become compromised, the credentials become compromised, that it still requires a secondary person to be able to go and approve an action, approve or deny an action. And so,
Yeah, you don't want somebody recovering a bad backup or snapshot, right? You want those controls in place where, I would even bump it up to 3 or 4 people to take a look, for those checks and balances, said, okay, is this a known good, clean snapshot we're going to recover from? So,
Actually, that is interesting. I never thought of that. Of me, you're okay. So you got hit, or you need to recover from a backup or thing, and you're the person, the server admin, rack and stack 'em servers. Yep, I got it. I worked that into the conversation. It only took 50 minutes. Yes. But anyway, you're there testing out the backups, or you're trying to restore from a certain thing, and you're like, all right, I'm just going to restore this. Who's even to think twice about restoring it, that it could be corrupt and you could be restoring malicious data or content into your environment that wasn't there, but now is now, and you are the person who injected it.
and think about their state of mind. I mean, if you're a guy at a medium-sized organization, you've got the C-suite looking at you to recover so they don't lose money. So you could be pretty frantic, right? It's a stressful
I'm freaking
situation.
out. I want to restore now,
Yeah.
now.
And
then you
so-
just went.
So that human element, having an extra layer where you have maybe a couple people that might have a little cooler heads about them, I think it's good to kind of have that, that 1, 2, 3, 4, or however many people you want to put for the approval process, to recover that clean snapshot or backup from, because like I said, it's taking in account that this is a stressful situation. Someone might just click a button because they're being, they've got, they're up against the wall, right? So
Yep.
they're trying to get this recovered as quick as possible. And I think a lot of times we don't talk about the stress and the emotional part that these kind of attacks can have. And so having these proper tools in place can really relieve a lot of that stress and that human error or element, right? So that's just,
you hit it right on the head, I think, right? John, you said, malicious threats or accidental compromises happen. And again, it comes right back to people. And so to your point, Jed, right, you can have all the plans in place, but and to take a quote from Mike Tyson, like, everybody has a plan until they get hit in the mouth. Right? So
How do we work that into this conversation?
Yeah, exactly.
He did it.
So having a safeguard there, which is a secondary approval process. And by the way, we call that quorum in Cohesity, right? It would essentially be, you'd be mitigating the risk of introducing bad or dirty data back into an environment that you just recently sanitized.
That's right.
And that can take sanitizing an environment can take a very long time. And so you don't want to double those efforts, because now you're trying to, you have your business continuity service level agreements, right? Every organization has their SLAs. And so you certainly don't want to double that, right? Your backup is against the wall, right? If you're the IT practitioner there, that's trying to recover, you don't want to introduce that bad data back in there. And so that can happen if you don't have these secondary approval processes in place.
No, I agree with you guys. All right, so we have to wrap things up. As quick as this went, we've already reached our max amount of time, and we still had so much more to talk about. Guys, we're going to have to do another podcast soon and really kind of dive deep into a specific of a couple of these topics that we talked about, not only training, but how do you mitigate it from a specific and states on there. We could probably encompass a whole series on this.
Yeah, just on AI alone, or future threats could, for sure.
Definitely. The way it's going, you never know. All right, everybody. We've been talking with Jed Wallace, staff technologist, and Vic Camacho, a principal technologist at Cohesity. Our topic today was the evolving ransomware threat and how to keep your data secure. Jed, Vic, thanks so much for joining me.
John, it's been a pleasure, sir. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Guys, I really appreciate it. This has been the Jon Myer Podcast. I'm your host, Jon Myer. Don't forget to hit that like, subscribe, and notify, because guess what? We're out of here.